Welcome everyone today to our webinar, Chaplaincy Resilience, the Group Support Model, which is one in our series on resilience sponsored by the Henry Luce Foundation. My name is Michael Skaggs. I'm Director of Programs for the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, and we're very happy to have you with us today. Before I introduce our guests, let me offer a couple of quick reminders for folks who might be new. Like most of our events, this is being recorded, and like I mentioned, we're live on Facebook and YouTube. If you need to leave early or miss a point or whatever, don't worry, you will receive a link to this recording in about a week or so, and you can always go back and watch it however much you want. We post it on the website, our YouTube channel, so you can always go back and find it. When you get that email, there's also a link to a feedback survey about your experience. Please, please, please spend 1 or 2 minutes filling that out. That lets us know what you think and how we can plan webinars in the future. So now let me introduce our guests, all three of whom are from the Albert and Jessie Danielsen Institute at Boston University. They've been wonderful partners throughout this project, and it's always a pleasure to speak with them. Miriam Bronstein is Director of Clinical Services. Laura Captari is the Institute's Postdoctoral Research Associate, and George Stavros is Executive Director. So welcome to all three of you. With that, I will turn it over to Laura, let you share your screen, and we will be off.
Thank you, Michael. Give me just a second and we'll get our slides queued up here. All right. George, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. We're really happy to be here with you all. One of the first things that we did as a team when we realized we were going to start providing these support groups was we wanted to recognize that we were living in a Zoom universe that was so much about screens and faces and in a way disembodied. So we decided that we would start each group with some sort of a grounding exercise that allowed participants to access their body. So we're going to give you an experiential look at that and just do maybe a 30-second relaxation exercise. So if you would just join in with us here. We want you to just start by getting your body grounded, however that would work for you. And there's tremendous flexibility built into this. You can stay seated, you can stand up, you can stretch out and lie down, whatever gives you a sense that your body's grounded, connected to the earth, and gives you some platform. First thing we want to do is just raise our hands, put them over our heart, and on your own time, just take 2 good cleansing breaths in and out. Good. All right, we're just going to get the blood flowing a little bit. Slowly, if you can, and without discomfort, raise your arms up and take them slowly above your head. When you get them up there, join your hands together. And with a little tension, but no strain, just give 2 or 3 pumps to the ceiling to stretch out your arms and elbows. And hold it there. Breathe in and slowly exhale and bring your arms down. All right. 2 final moves. One is make a little stretch, a little twist to your left. No strain, but a little stretch. Catch a breath and breathe yourself back to center. Little stretch and twist right. Hold it and breathe yourself back to center. Return your hands to your heart. With gratitude, take a couple good cleansing breaths to acknowledge the miracle of the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide with the environment. And come back in to the room. So that's how we start our chaplain support groups, with something like that. Our thinking again is, with everything the chaplains are dealing with on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis, the chance to come in and start with some guided relaxation. We found it to be helpful, and we've gotten good feedback that they appreciate us starting that way. Okay, speaking of starting, how did we come into doing these groups? So our partners at the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, specifically Shelley Rambo, who is a faculty member, colleague at the School of Theology at Boston University, approached us here at the Danielsen Institute when the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab was invited to think about how to provide some support services in general to chaplains who are on the front lines dealing with COVID. I think we all intuitively had some sense of what the stressors would be facing the chaplains. We didn't know specifically. What we have listed here are some of the things that we have learned over time now, having done these groups for almost a year. Some of the themes that have emerged about the challenges and stressors facing chaplains during the pandemic. They include things like just the general isolation. These are going to be things many of us can identify with: the isolation and difficulty accessing normal ways of coping, being separated from colleagues physically, religious institutions and services being closed. This one's probably at the forefront, and things we really encountered in the first set of groups that we did so poignantly was the overwhelming exposure to suffering, trauma, loss, and death. Those things, of course, that's part of chaplaincy all the time, but this was at levels, intensities, and depth that none of the chaplains who were participating in the groups had ever experienced before. As most of us are aware, it's like policies and procedures got turned upside down and recreated during COVID. And so there were tremendous stresses associated with that. Chaplains also were coming up against unique disagreements with decisions that their individual institutions were making about how to provide spiritual care. Things that would often cut them off from doing things that intuitively they knew would be healing or helpful. Another stressor is the keen awareness of health inequities with limited power to make change. The people the chaplains were trying to serve, have been trying to serve during the pandemic. It's just been obvious that there are privileges about receiving medical care and healthcare services that really were exposed in a big way during COVID. Then there was amongst the chaplains a sense, and again, my guess is those of you who are chaplains know what this is that most non-chaplains really don't have a full understanding or even a partial understanding of what it has meant to be serving as a chaplain during COVID. And there's some isolation in that, as well as the personal lives of the chaplain participants, all facing adversity, risk, and loss in ways that were both part of the rhythms of their life, but heightened because of COVID. All right, one of the ways that we've tried to understand the experience of chaplains and of communities in general is reflected in this model that is a community disaster recovery model. It's something that is quite useful and accurate when considering the impact of some sort of community disaster, a hurricane, an earthquake, a flood, a political upheaval. And this model, as you can see, has some timelines associated with it. It also has some categories. What we are finding is that the categories are quite helpful. That the impact of the pandemic was very, very real. And, you know, most of us can think back to March 2020 as a time when the impact really started to hit. What is less transferable about this model is any kind of specific time frame associated with it. And we think part of why that's the case is that with the pandemic, there have been multiple impacts. There have been recurrences of spikes in cases. There has been ongoing traumatic impact around loss for the chaplains and for people in general. So we don't want to adhere super tightly to the timeframes here. What is helpful and transferable, though, is the idea that there were heroic responses by chaplains and healthcare providers and frontline workers throughout the world to respond to the needs that emerged from the pandemic's entry into society and the ways in which it started to have its impact. So many people stretched themselves so far, did such creative and relentless work in order to attend to all the needs that emerged, that there was some sense in many communities of, I guess we could call it a honeymoon, or a sense of well-being that's driven by meaning of doing something important in response to helping people. Again, though, what's tricky about thinking about a honeymoon period is interspersed amidst the pandemic were the severe and destructive upheavals and important upheavals around racial justice, around political turmoil, around the storming of the Capitol in Washington, that even in the midst of heroic responses and a sense of meaning associated with that, it still got very difficult in interspersed ways with other issues. So the idea of a disillusionment is something that we very much have dealt with and are dealing with within the chaplain groups. And I'd say we're starting to deal with and encounter some of the work of reconstruction, creating new beginnings. Okay, so why support groups in particular? I mean, we could have done other things. We could have done individual interventions. We could have put out flyers and pamphlets. And actually, Chaplaincy Innovation Lab is doing other things. But why the Danielsen Institute engaged in this project with support groups? Number of reasons. They are good ways to decrease isolation and increase solidarity with other spiritual care workers, people that chaplains wouldn't have access to otherwise, because other people wouldn't really understand their experiences. Support groups can normalize vicarious trauma and burnout reactions and associated emotions. They provide a structured, regular, rhythmic opportunity to step back from the intensity of work and engage with some processing and meaning making. Participants can internalize the group itself as a reflective, grounding presence, a place to connect with others, a reliable, if you will, kind of home base to tap into. For chaplains who hold minority identities, certainly it can be an important context for pushing against systemic oppression and minority stress as they make connections both with other chaplains with minority identities and allies within the group. And the online format, which we always wondered, what would happen if we couldn't meet in person? Is it going to be as effective? We're so pleasantly surprised and aware that the online format actually has provided much more connection and holding than we would have anticipated. And we're really grateful for that. All right, finally, what do these groups look like? And these were things we didn't know exactly what to put together. These are things that have come together over the course of the year. But the basic model is we're psychotherapists, so we're aware of relational group processes and making space for people and linking experiences with one another, exploring emotions. So that's part of the support group. As mentioned before, we do some somatic and body-based work with relaxation exercises and encouraging people to be in touch with themselves physically. We really encourage kind of a space-making model where, and chaplains are good at this anyway. I think that's been one of the great things for us is it just comes naturally to most chaplains to be good listeners and to reflect back experience. So in some ways for us as co-facilitators, our job is to get out of the way and let the chaplains take care of each other. It's really remarkable the level of care that they express for one another. And then there's the opportunity for exploring and identifying cultural and spiritual strengths and discovering and creating rituals and practices through the group that really do promote a lot of connection and meaning. And right now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Miriam Bronstein.
Hi, everybody. So we thought we would just share some constructs with you all that have become pretty important for us at the Danielsen Institute. Our colleague, Steve Sandage, who directs our research center, has developed a model called the Relational Spirituality Model. And what that has to do with is this idea of spirituality being about our relationship to the sacred, and that many aspects of spirituality really have to do with relationships and relatedness, whether that's to a sort of higher power or to community or to text, tradition, etc. Among the ideas that are embedded in this relational spirituality model are the three ideas that are listed on this slide: spiritual dwelling, spiritual seeking, spiritual struggles. And I think this forms both a kind of framework of understanding for those of us who have been co-leading, providing these support groups. And I think it also can describe some of what happens in the groups. So the idea here is that there are various dynamics and dialectical movements or moments in time in kind of psycho-spiritual functioning. So there can be periods of spiritual dwelling, a kind of sense of being grounded at home in a secure, regulating, familiar kind of context. And there could be spiritual practices or rituals that promote communal affiliation, grounding, intimacy, and that help us feel emotionally and spiritually regulated. This tends to work in kind of in tandem with often periods of spiritual seeking, where there are times where people are questing, are exploring, are curious. There may be questions that arise, doubts that arise that allow a person to explore and pursue growth and grow spiritually. become more aware of the complexities. And of course, there's the experience of spiritual struggle, crises of faith, periods of deconstruction, challenges to things we've known and believed. And spiritual struggles can kind of move in two directions. Sometimes they really help catalyze growth and seeking. Sometimes they create tremendous distress and dysregulation and stuckness. So these are things that we at the Danielsen Institute tend to think about a lot. And I think in providing these support groups, I think one of our ideas was to kind of create a place of dwelling, a kind of, in the language of attachment theory, kind of a safe haven or a secure base that people could be in together with other chaplains, reflecting on what it means to be a chaplain, what led them to become chaplains in the first place, what are guiding, orienting beliefs or rituals. The pandemic and all the political and social unrest, racial justice struggles certainly evoked a lot of seeking and in some cases a lot of struggle. And we also conceived of the group as a place where people could help one another with the struggles, with the questions, companion one another along the path of seeking for perhaps comfort, new meanings, sustaining resources. So we have just found those kind of frameworks and constructs useful. And I'll just share a couple of kind of vignettes, not really full vignettes, but kind of moments or themes that came up in some of the groups that I've co-led, things that chaplains shared. So a couple of examples for me of spiritual dwelling were times when a chaplain would share a very powerful experience, positive experience of being able to attend a person at their transition from life to death, and raise that experience, deepen that experience for the person who was passing away and perhaps for their family. And that in some cases, chaplains shared experiences like that, which were very grounding for them, which were very confirming of their vocation and of the importance and fulfillment involved. And I think sharing stories like that is very, very, just very strengthening for everyone listening. An example that comes to mind of spiritual seeking is a particular chaplain who's also a writer, who shared some of the writings, the reflections and creative pieces she had written, which really explored the complexity of the demands around the pandemic, and helped her make sense of questions and new dilemmas that arose when, for example, there are too many patients to get around to all the time in a hospital setting. And with spiritual struggles, there were certainly, I shouldn't say it in the past tense, we're still running groups now, but I'm remembering back to a particular instance of a chaplain sharing just a crisis, a sense of doubt. I don't know if I can do this work. I was so excited about it. It was so meaningful and uplifting to me. Now I'm confronted with so much loss and death. I'm not sure I can bear it. I'm not sure I can continue. And having a safe place to share that type of vocational and spiritual struggle and hear from other chaplains about how they were also navigating those kinds of dilemmas. So now I'll just say a little bit more about the model that we've been using. The project goal with the grant funding from the Luce Foundation and guidance from Chaplaincy Innovation Lab was to try to serve a lot of chaplains. We hoped, beginning approximately a year ago or August of 2020, and going through this December of 2021, our hope has been to serve 250 chaplains. And we seem to be on course to complete that, which is a really nice feeling. I guess it shows by the response we've gotten of people registering and signing up for our groups that there really is a need and there is really a desire to get together with other chaplains. So that's been one of the goals. What we came up with, both on a practical level in terms of how are we going to serve enough people over the amount of time allotted, was that we would do short-term groups. So people register for a group. There's once a group cohort is established, that's a stable group in the sense that newcomers do not join partway through the group intervention. We initially tried 4 sessions. We found that wasn't really quite enough. 5 sessions seemed to work better. And we decided to meet every other week on Zoom. This seemed to allow for some relationships and an internalization of the group experience to happen over a slightly longer period of time, a 10-week rather than 5 weeks in a row. Also we found chaplains are extraordinarily busy in general, and certainly during the pandemic period, the demand on them has been so high. So every other week seemed to actually be something people could fit into their schedules. And we meet for an hour and 15 minutes for each session. And we've had some wonderful diversity in the groups. Chaplains of different ages and stages in their career, working in all different settings and chaplaincy contexts. And even, all around the United States, we've had to be careful in getting clear about the time zones and making sure everybody knows when to Zoom in. So that's been really, really interesting, having people from California and, Pennsylvania and Maine, and then even internationally. We've had chaplains from Nigeria, Australia, England. So that's really made for a rich mix. Typically, the membership is 6 to 10 people. Sometimes we start with 9 or 10, and we may have a little bit of attrition. And it's also a diverse group in terms of religious backgrounds and affiliations. And so we've been very explicit about these being interreligious and spiritually oriented, but non-sectarian gathering places. I would say that just in terms of who has actually registered and been part of the group so far, there's definitely a predominance of Christian denominations represented, but nevertheless, we've had Muslim chaplains and Jewish chaplains and Buddhist chaplains and a sprinkling of other groups as well. As mentioned already, we are mental health care providers, and we co-lead the groups. 2 people lead. The mental health background and training that we have is certainly useful. We do not view this as a therapy group, but rather a support group, but it's useful to have that knowledge of of group process, group dynamics, counseling techniques. We've also tried to encourage members who'd like to continue to be in touch with one another independently after the formal group meetings end. So different groups have moved in different ways with that. We give people an option to share their contact information if desired with somebody who offers to kind of gather it. And some groups have decided to continue meeting with one another. And we've also provided a survey at pre-group point in time and after the group as well, to just measure things relating to the experience of burnout, that also kind of look at emotional, psychological resilience, and that look at what the group intervention has contributed in terms of hopefully of resilience. And then as has been noted already, we start our groups with a brief mindfulness or grounding practice. And I'll come back to that in a moment. We've created a very simple frame, kind of, you could say, agenda for the group. We felt it would be helpful to begin each session and close each session with kind of a ritual. So, I think because of the population in our groups who value spiritual practice and are familiar with it and know how to make use of it, we thought that would be helpful to create some sort of opening, closing ritual, but also because it is psychologically holding and regulating to provide some familiar sort of format that people can kind of lean into. So George gave you an example of one possible type of grounding practice. It's really open to each co-leader what they want to offer at the beginning of the group. So sometimes there's, more of a focus on a kind of more traditional mindfulness type practice. Sometimes it's more breath oriented. Sometimes it's using visualization, any variety of things, but we're very careful to not draw upon any particular explicit religious components that would, pertain specifically to one religion. And it's already been mentioned that, finding a way to come into the body when you're on Zoom is a good idea, given that we're just little squares of faces to each other. It helps us become more present and more embodied. And it's also a really useful thing when we're looking at the impact of exposure to trauma, which these chaplains have had a massive exposure to all kinds of stress and trauma. And our hope is that both for the group session itself, there's a bit of regulation that can occur by offering a kind of somatic practice at the beginning, but that just sort of plants the seed that these are good regulating, self-soothing techniques to use, on a regular basis. In the very first meeting, we always go over a set of shared group agreements that creates some group norms and some safety. We talk about confidentiality and things like that. In subsequent sessions, we'll often, because it's been 2 weeks earlier, we'll often summarize some of the themes or topics that were discussed in the last meeting. And then we really just open it up. And it's a chance for people to bring up whatever is important to them, to introduce themselves and explain more about what's happening in their setting, what's going well, what's very difficult. There's things that we as co-leaders attend to. We're thinking about what's happening in people's spiritual lives, what the particular challenges the chaplains are going through, what emotions are on the surface. We try to help people reflect on resources, their personal strengths, the strengths they have from their spiritual lives, and to really look at the experience of the individual chaplain within the system that they are working. And as noted earlier, chaplains are very good listeners. They're very good at supporting one another. They're well trained in being empathic, and typically those conversations just really flow very naturally. And then towards the end of the group, the co-leaders really just, provide a little bit of summary and synthesis. And then again, we close with a kind of a ritual. We always offer a poem that we hope speaks to some of the experiences chaplains have been going through, and that lifts up some kind of theme around resilience and coping and keeping on. So on the next slide, this is an example of a poem that we would share. And this might be a poem that a number of you are familiar with. It's called Clearing by Martha Postlethwaite. And one of the things I like about this poem is that I feel like in a certain way, it describes a bit of what we hope, the kind of clearing we hope that the group provides for people. So I'll just read this aloud. And just as we do in our groups, if you would like to take a moment to just take in this poem, close your eyes if you'd like, or allow yourself to let the poem affect you, please feel free to do so. Do not try to save the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world so worthy of rescue. We'll just move on now to Laura talking a bit more about the kinds of themes we've encountered in the groups.
Thank you, Miriam. So yes, now that you all have heard a little bit about the background and context and some of what happens in these groups, the emerging model, I'm excited to share with you some of the themes, and by no means is this exhaustive, but just to give some examples and get you all thinking and curious about what may be happening for yourselves in the context in which you work or teach or supervise. So one of the areas that the group often moves into through those 5 sessions is reflecting on and naming personal challenges that have come up during this time of really dual pandemics of COVID-19 and also racism. And so members will often talk about individual and family impacts. Early on, in particular, fear of impacting their families, fear of infecting partners or children from coming home from the workplace, not being able to travel or use normal ways of coping. Missing spontaneous interactions with colleagues, what we might think about as relational coping, whether it's passing in the hallway and sharing a joke or getting lunch together. These things that were interwoven into the workday disappeared or got lost with either remote work or the safety procedures and protocol that were needed. A number of members have talked about financial hardship, whether that's been reduced hours, instability or changes in their housing. Some members have been in CPE or started a new job or moved during the pandemic. So there's been the challenges of getting to know a new system and a new group of coworkers in the midst of so much that's already constantly changing. And then especially as we've seen vaccination rates go up, and in some parts of the country, level of cases go down in the last few months, it seems like there's been a clearing in the groups to begin to reflect on, what if we just lived through what actually has happened in the last 15 months? And what does it mean for me and my vocation? How long can I do this sort of work? And kind of thinking about different chaplaincy roles or jobs in response to figuring out how to integrate all that the last year and a half has meant. There's also been the sense, like George mentioned, that often family members, friends, and people's faith community has had a different experience of the pandemic, and that there's some limitations to that social support, that there's a little bit of an internal push and pull, like, do I share this story with my partner or with my fellow parishioner, or will it traumatize them as I am trying to make sense of what I just witnessed and encountered? And we talk a lot about vicarious trauma as a recurring theme in these groups, both the way the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing psychospiritual struggles and activated both acute and more chronic post-traumatic stress reactions. So in addition to some of these personal challenges, another area of challenge that often comes up in group has been around systemic interactions and barriers. And one thing that our group members bring to group a lot is just this sense of feeling alone, lack of support, often lack of appropriate staffing at work, and this sense that no matter what I do, it's not enough. Like, I'm here in group with you, but someone may be on their deathbed and I'm not there with them, one floor above me. So this very difficult internal tension around, how do I take care of myself while trying to meet pretty overwhelming needs, which of course has led to themes of exhaustion, often feeling invisible. It was named in one group the drastic shift from being a hero to zero, and how early on in the pandemic, chaplains and other frontline workers were named as heroes. And now, as things are shifting, they often feel invisible and are grappling with their sense of identity and vocation, especially in the context of some systems that are where chaplaincy is not so well integrated, and where they don't feel understood by those in other professions that are working around them. Just a sense of their colleagues' uncertainty about, who are you and what do you do and why are you here, especially in cases where chaplains early on were prohibited from going to work in person, where they were not considered frontline staff. There's been this theme of moral injury that we've been working through in groups, and a sense of guilt. Also, the realistic situation that for some members, they needed to make a change in their work situation, whether to protect their own health or a family member who had underlying conditions. And so a theme we often mull over together and work with is that when you're in a broken system, you can feel broken. And just reckoning with working in these very imperfect systems where spiritual care is often not valued, and how that can set chaplains up for kind of impossible situations where they're given more to do than any one of them has capacity for. Another systemic thing that often comes up in groups is chaplains' desire to address health disparities and promote more inclusive interreligious chaplaincy, but often facing institutional barriers in that. And then in our groups, not only are folks bringing in and processing challenges, but on the other side, much of what they take from the experience has been around identifying personal support and capacities. And so there's a number listing here, far more than we have time to go into today, but just to give you a few examples. Group members have talked about developing spiritual rituals that are strong enough to hold the weight of uncertainty, grief, and change, recognizing that their previous spiritual practices or self-care routine has not been enough, that more was needed. We talk a lot about self-stewardship and the importance of listening to our bodies and our souls in order to have longevity in spiritual caregiving. And surprisingly, we've discovered in some of the groups the healing power of humor and levity, recognizing that we will heal and come out of this pandemic not only through our tears, but through our laughter together. One of the big things that comes up is we only have 5 groups with each cohort, 5 meetings, has been this recognition that to do this sort of work of spiritual caregiving, folks are realizing it's really vital to them to have a support network around them, especially folks that are not their direct co-workers. So having that little bit of distance, so there's not a dual relationship, and they can have a space to process and make meaning of what's happening for them and in their workplace. And then to address this theme of moral injury that we've seen coming up a lot in groups during the pandemic, some of the big takeaways and themes that we've worked with in group have been helping our members to reckon with and accept the limitations of what any one chaplain can offer, while cultivating a sense of meaning and mindful presence in each sacred moment that they share. And focusing on what they can offer, rather than getting caught up in what's beyond their control or capacity, and using creativity and innovation to grapple with what can we do with what we have. And then some of those changes and growth points have extended beyond just the personal to the systemic. And here's a few things that our members are reflecting on that they're noticing in their workplaces or taking from the group experience, including a greater sense of boldness in speaking to healthcare authorities and advocating for the needs of the patients they're caring for. Also discovering new ways of thinking about and doing chaplaincy care, and noticing that in some systems there's an increased awareness of who a chaplain is and what they do, and an increasing attention to the importance of spiritual care as part of holistic treatment. So we could go on with themes and stories, and I want to just close by sharing a little bit of some of our group members' words, what they are taking from this space. More than we have time to read all of these quotes, but I'll just point out that as chaplains are leaving this group experience, they're naming how vital it's been to have a safe place with other chaplains that has provided something unique to them that they couldn't get in individual therapy or with family members or even in their church or faith community, to connect with colleagues in a professional but confidential setting and be able to begin this messy process of making meaning and giving language to what are we living through? What does this mean for who I am as a chaplain and the way I envision my vocation moving forward? In addition to their words, Miriam mentioned that we've been gathering some pre and post data, and it's always great to be able to step back to a bird's eye view and just ask the question of, is this working? And so what we know so far from the quantitative analyses that we've run is that as a result of being part of this group experience, looking at the difference between pre and post scores, that group members are reporting significant increases in their level of resilience, flourishing, and sense of personal accomplishment as a chaplain, and reporting a significant decrease in their level of burnout and the spiritual struggles they're grappling with. So I'll leave you with this visual. It's something we're continuing to work with and add to, but just recognizing these 4 domains as really important in cultivating resilience: connection, regulation, meaning, and action, restoring a sense of agency. And so lots of implications we could talk about for chaplaincy, for training, supervision, but I'll stop here and let's take some time to hear from you, your thoughts, questions, and reactions.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you all. This has been such an interesting, it's been interesting all along watching this project unfold, but especially here to see things sort of condensed down into one place has been great. So we do have a few minutes for Q&A here, and at the end I want to make sure that we ask some of these questions here. The very first one we got was, how can I sign up for a group? And of course, we are still registering for groups later in the year, so I'm going to put a link into the chat right now that everybody should be able to see. That will take you to this project's page at the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab website, and you can find all of the information there, as well as a link to, it's sort of a brief informational survey. You just want to make sure that this is the right place for you, and that you don't need maybe a different type of support. So please do check that out. We are registering folks, and so we look forward to hearing from you. Another question has to do with sort of the roles that chaplains have in their job and how that might impact their experience in the support group. And the question was specifically about, do you have people in management positions, in director level positions, that have participated so far? And if so, how have their experiences differed from those of sort of staff chaplains, or however you want to describe that, if there is a qualitative difference?
I know we've had members that are in supervisory roles, and I would say the experience has been really enriching to the group process as we move to that frame of thinking systemically, not only about one-on-one chaplain to patient interaction, but also those supervisors bringing in the challenges that are happening in their workplaces and thinking about what needs to change on a systemic level. How do I support the chaplains working under me?
This is a great question. What has surprised you the most as facilitators so far? And I know that that's sort of a loaded question. These are such intimate groups, but what have you found really surprising about this process, if anything?
It's interesting. I'm not sure I would have put it quite as surprising, but I've just been delighted by and moved by, the diversity, the people's the range of ways people do make meaning spiritually and psychologically. What coping strategies, what rituals, one person finds helpful that maybe another has never thought about.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the stories shared, it's just been an amazement, a feeling of amazement, perhaps more than surprise. It's generated great admiration and respect in me.
I would say in a setting, I made some mention of this earlier, in a setting that's online with people who've never met for a short period of time, with facilitators that they have no idea who we are, the risk that consistently people are willing to take in being vulnerable, and the subsequent response, not only to hold that vulnerability, but for it to cascade and for others in the group then to share their own vulnerability. I wouldn't have expected it to be that cohesive a process as it has been. It's been beautiful and humbling, actually, just to be witness to it.
You know, when this project began and we began to talk with each other about how this might work, I think we all had a general idea that a support group is a good thing, right? I mean, we were hearing from chaplains, the lab was hearing from chaplains that something like this was needed, but of course we had no idea how it was actually going to unfold. So that's so validating of this model, and it's just wonderful to know that this is a helpful medium for people. And what I have found in a lot of ways is that even though how we have connected over the past year and a half has changed a lot, it's not always just sort of a second best method. There are things about it that are maybe even better, and lessons that we don't want to lose as we get back to sort of normalcy, whatever that might be. Anthony, I see your question, and I'm going to sort of combine it a little bit with one of my own and see if we can answer sort of a broader question. I want to know a little bit about conflict, sort of the opposite of what George just said. Because, of course, chaplains are all bringing their own experience, and that can be really different. So Anthony's asking about sort of group disruptors, folks who maybe who need a little guidance with the group model. How have you handled those sorts of instances, and what has kind of brought them about, if anything? Or maybe everyone's getting along just fine.
Such a good question. And one thing we failed to name is how a key part of this program has been our weekly meeting as group leaders, meeting every week to process what's happening in the groups, to really think deeply about what we're living through in group that mirrors what also is happening in the world, whether it's the conflict or the chaos. But I would just say we start the group with going over kind of setting these group norms and agreements of really welcoming and appreciating, celebrating diversity and different backgrounds, and also naming that there will be differences that come up. And this is how we want to handle them when they come up. We want to be open and curious and have humility to learn from each other. Those moments have definitely happened in group where someone may jump in excited to share and move a little bit more toward like advice giving or problem solving. And so part of our role as group leaders is to really bring the group back to open up the space to being companions and witnesses with each other, rather than getting into telling someone else what to do, because their experience may be very different from yours.
Right.
I'd say on a rare occasion, we've had something that's been disruptive, with some real kind of pain involved, where there's been, an unwitting microaggression, certainly no malice intended, but sometimes there have been, theological differences or religious differences that might be, experienced as hurtful by one person. And so occasionally we've done a little bit of work actually outside of the group meeting, because these are short-term support groups and we're not going to have a lot of time to do like a working through process we would in a therapy group. We've sometimes as group leaders reached out one-on-one to a member to just sort of say, well, you may not have been aware of this, but this seemed to happen, or we noticed this happened, how are you feeling? And I think that's contained things pretty nicely for the most part.
And I should note that part of the process of setting all of this up is to make clear along the way that this is not intended as, it's not group therapy, it's not one-on-one mental health provision, but Danielsen has made very sure to provide sort of other resources, directions you might want to take things, so that if you sign up for one of these groups and it turns out that what you need is something else, don't worry. It's not like you're going to be forced to finish this or just take what you can get out of this. We can direct you sort of in the right direction. We want, this is supposed to be a healing, restorative place, and we wouldn't want anyone to not attend for those reasons. I see we're here at the top of the hour, so I don't want to keep everyone longer than necessary. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today and our colleagues from the Danielsen Institute. This has been such a wonderful experience working together, the lab, the Danielsen Institute. I really want to thank Shelley Rambo, one of our key collaborators, for connecting us there at Boston University. As we've mentioned a few times, these groups are going to continue through the end of the year. So, gosh, even though it's already July, there is still time to sign up. We're working on an ebook out of this project, so there will be sort of a thing that you can always go back and refer to. And anyone who knows the work that I do for the lab, you know that I just talk and talk and talk about our achievements. So don't worry, you're going to hear about this as it unfolds. We're very excited to be doing this. Thank you all for joining us. It's been a great afternoon. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.